On June 1, 1946, justice was carried out in Bucharest. Marshal Ion Antonescu, Romania's wartime dictator, stood before a firing squad. Alongside him were three others: Mihai Antonescu, his deputy; Gheorghe Alexinu, the governor of occupied Transnistria; and Constantine Vasiliu, a senior military officer. These men had been tried and convicted by the Romanian People's Tribunal for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Their regime had aligned Romania with Nazi Germany, sending troops to fight on the Eastern Front, deporting and killing Jews and Roma, and enforcing brutal occupation policies in territories under their control. On that day, all four were led out into the courtyard of Jalava prison. They were tied to wooden posts, blindfolded, and placed before the rifles of the firing squad. With a single volley of shots, the dictatorship that had ruled Romania during its darkest years came to a violent end. In June 1945, the United States military carried out a rare execution of a Nazi war criminal. The man was Kurt Bruns, a Wehrmacht captain convicted of ordering the murder of two American prisoners of war who revealed their Jewish heritage. During the Battle of the Bulge, Bruns learned that the captured men, part of the elite Ritchie Boys intelligence unit, spoke fluent German and were German-born Jews. He reportedly declared, "Jews have no right to live in Germany," and ordered them executed. A U.S. military tribunal swiftly tried Bruns for war crimes. He became the first German war criminal to be executed by firing squad, shot on June 15, 1945, in a quarry at Dinsdorf, Allied-occupied Germany. Bruns was even allowed to wear his uniform, stripped of insignia, as the sentence was carried out. This execution wasn't by hanging, an uncommon but symbolic military judgment at the time, especially for someone tried before the war officially ended. Philip Gutlich was executed in November 1945 at Bruxelles Prison. He had been convicted by a U.S. military tribunal for his role in the Russelsheim massacre, when 6 American airmen were beaten to death by a mob of civilians after an air raid in August 1944. As the sentence was carried out, Gutlich showed a display of faith. Before approaching the gallows, he kissed a small Bible and a crucifix offered to him by a priest. It was a solemn gesture, perhaps of repentance, perhaps of desperation, in his final minutes. Moments later, he was led to the gallows. The noose was fixed, the trapdoor released, and Philip Gutlich's life came to an end. Do you believe Philip Gutlich's execution was true justice or simply an act of wartime vengeance carried out after World War II? Let's talk about it in the comments. Joseph Wendy, just 18 years old, was executed on November 11, 1944, in Toul, France. A young Polish man drafted into the German army. He crossed behind American lines disguised as a civilian slave laborer. Caught, he was tried by a U.S. military commission on October 18, 1944, and convicted of espionage. On the day of his execution, Wendy was led to the shooting site in a farmhouse garden. Witnesses reported a solemn scene. Military police positioned him. A priest uttered last prayers, and amid tense stillness, the firing squad took aim. The shots rang out, and the 18-year-old spy fell. A stark reminder of how war turns mere youths into symbols of betrayal. Today, a rare film clip of this execution circulates in historical archives, an enduring, haunting record of Wendy's final moments. On May 22, 1946, in Prague, Nazi official Karl Hermann Frank faced the ultimate punishment. Frank had been one of the most powerful men in occupied Czechoslovakia. As state secretary, he oversaw the brutal repression of resistance and was directly responsible for the massacre at Lidice, the village annihilated after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. Hundreds of men were shot, women deported, and children sent to concentration camps. After the war, Frank was captured by American forces and handed over to Czechoslovakia. His trial in Prague revealed the full extent of his crimes. Witness after witness described his iron-fisted rule and the terror he unleashed upon the Czech people. The verdict was inevitable: death. On that May morning, thousands gathered to watch. Frank was led to the gallows, pale and silent. There, he was executed by the pole-hanging method, a brutal technique where the condemned is hoisted upward by the neck until death. On May 28, 1946, at Landsberg prison in Germany, Anton Indres faced his final moments. Indres had served as an SS medical officer at Dachau, one of the most notorious Nazi concentration camps. There, he was accused of brutal mistreatment and direct participation in the killings of prisoners. Survivors described not only the starvation and forced labor, but also the cruelty of the very men who were supposed to represent medicine and healing. After Germany's defeat, the Allied powers sought justice. Indres was tried by a U.S. military tribunal during what became known as the Dachau trials. These proceedings exposed the horrors of the camps, giving voice to witnesses who had endured unimaginable suffering. Testimonies spoke of guards who beat and executed inmates, of experiments conducted without mercy, and of a system that reduced human beings to numbers. Anton Indres was convicted of war crimes, and his sentence was death by hanging. On the morning of his execution, he was led to the gallows, accompanied by a priest. Witnesses recalled his calm demeanor, but also the swiftness with which justice was carried out. On March 18, 1942, in the town of Belchatow, Poland, German occupation authorities carried out a public execution. 10 Jewish were brought to the town square and hanged in full view of the local population. The victims had been arrested earlier that month along with several others. While some were released, these 10 were chosen for execution. Nazi officials used such spectacles as a means of intimidation, forcing residents to watch as the condemned men were placed on the gallows. Archival records identify several of the victims by name, preserved in testimonies and memorial books compiled after the war. This execution was one of many carried out across occupied Poland during 1942, intended to terrorize communities and enforce absolute obedience under German rule. Do the shadows of these wartime atrocities still influence global politics today? Let's discuss it in the comments. Available in 22 languages. Pietro Koch was one of fascist Italy's most feared secret police leaders during World War II. As head of the notorious Banda Koch, he was responsible for brutal arrests, torture, and executions of resistance members and civilians. After the fall of Mussolini, Koch was captured, tried for war crimes, and sentenced to death. On June 5, 1945, he was executed by firing squad, a dramatic end for a man once feared across Italy. Gunther Billing was a German paratrooper involved in one of World War II's most daring infiltration missions. Disguised in American uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge, he and 2 comrades, including Manfred Pernis, were sent behind enemy lines to sabotage Allied communications and supply routes. The mission failed when they were captured by U.S. forces. Tried as spies under the Geneva Convention, they faced the inevitable death sentence. On December 23, 1944, Gunther Billing and his fellow saboteurs were executed by firing squad. But was this a fair sentence, or simply wartime vengeance? On December 1, 1945, near Rome, German General Anton Dosler stood before a firing squad. During World War II, Dosler had ordered the execution of 15 captured American soldiers in Italy. These men, taken prisoner in uniform, should have been protected under the Geneva Convention. Instead, they were shot, an order Dosler signed personally. At his trial, the general offered the familiar defense: "I was only following orders." But the U.S. military tribunal rejected it. Blind obedience could not excuse the deliberate murder of prisoners of war. That cold morning, Dosler was tied to a post, his hands bound, his eyes covered. The command was given. Rifles fired in unison. The general fell lifeless. Anton Dosler was the first German general executed by the Allies after World War II. But was this execution truly justified? At Landsberg prison, Wilhelm Wagner, an SS officer from the Dachau concentration camp, was led to the gallows. Wagner had been tried by a U.S. military tribunal and convicted of war crimes. Survivors testified that he took part in brutal selections of prisoners, sending some to forced labor and others to certain death. His name was tied to cruelty and violence inside one of the most infamous camps of the Nazi regime. But Wagner's execution was remembered not only for his crimes. It was remembered for the way he faced his death. As he walked to the gallows, he did not tremble. Witnesses described him as calm, almost casual. This image, a condemned SS officer smiling at the edge of death, has remained one of the most chilling and unusual accounts of World War II executions. But what do you think? Was it courage in the face of death? Or was it simply the disturbing mindset of a man shaped by brutality and war?